Well, good afternoon and welcome back to this week's Table Talk, our 10th episode of Season 2, the final episode this season. And this week at the table, we are very privileged and we had great pleasure to have Abigail Engel with us. Welcome.
Hi.
Good to have you. You might recognize Abigail, a co-leader of Moms Ministry here at River Oaks. And you and Seth lead a small group in your home. That's great. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then Pastor Andrew, you were up this past Sunday with the completion of Romans.
Yeah. We're not done with Romans.
We're never done with Romans.
Just concluding the series.
For now, so chapter 16.
Yeah.
Well, in this final episode of season 2 and getting through the letter to Romans, let's start with some questions. It's kind of what we do here. So the first question from Jonathan. Andrew, in looking at other letters from Paul, so Jonathan looked through all the other letters here, most only list a few names in the final greetings. Although Colossians, he says, comes closest, about half the names is Romans. Do you think that says anything in particular about Paul's intention to this letter to Romans?
Well, I don't know if I have a great answer for Jonathan.
Yeah.
I want to commend Jonathan for being a Berean. I mean, that's some great attention to detail right there, searching the scriptures. Here's the thing we know about Romans, which was probably a little bit different from, say, like a letter he wrote to Corinth or a letter he wrote to Ephesus. He hadn't been to Rome before when he wrote this letter.
That's true. Yeah.
So he's writing to folks, a city he hasn't been to. Now, we do know that the time in which Jesus came was ideally situated for the transmission of the gospel because there was a common language throughout the Mediterranean basin. There was a road network. And so people today just assume that, they didn't travel back then the way we travel today. But they actually said there was a fair amount of travel in the first century. And that Paul most likely just, if we think that he came to Christ around 34 AD, began his ministry somewhere around 36, 37 AD. So about he wrote this in 57 AD, 20 years have gone by. It's likely that he has had encounters, he's met many of these people, but I wonder if the reason the greetings are so long is just because he hasn't been there yet.
Yeah.
And so maybe he doesn't have as much credibility in Rome as he does in the other places, and there's this way of the fact that he's recognizing and making all these greetings sort of adds to the fact that, this letter is coming from someone established.
Right.
And help paving the way for his visit, too.
Right. So I do think it's interesting. I mean, we don't hear sermons often, that is really the list of names, right?
Yeah.
Had you ever thought about that before, Abigail? Or have you ever noticed the greeting in Roman here at the end? Or?
So in Bible college, they a lot of times would talk about which genre you're looking at. And one thing that they did talk about a lot was, is there an absence of something that is typically in a book? And there's usually probably a reason for that, that kind of thing. So so obviously there is a reason why there's a lot of names listed, but I mean, it makes sense. But
do you write letters? Personal letters?
Not very many.
So you're not part of the letter writing generation? No. Okay, all right. Yeah, because I'm thinking about like writing letters home, and this is almost like the, and tell, Uncle Joe hello, and tell the neighbor hello, and that sort of thing. And for me, one of my hypotheses on this was that you mentioned the diversity in this list. Men, women, Jew, Gentile, slave, servant. And, he was speaking into the tension of diversity and divisiveness.
That's right.
And so I thought, well, maybe he did so many just to say, look, we all get along and move the gospel forward. Surely you can too. And also, he makes mention that his hope in this letter is that when I come through on my way to Spain, I can stay with you guys. You can help me get there. And so look, be like all these others who have helped supported me.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe a teaching in that. But the diversity brings up another question around this that was sent in to us earlier this morning. And from that, it was a great question. It says, why are there so many women mentioned in the greeting if Paul would also in other places, I think in 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, tell women to be silent and not permit them to teach? How could they have done all these things and been supportive and worked in ministry if that was also sort of the vibe Paul was sending? Does that make sense? Yeah.
That was a question for Abigail, right?
Yeah.
This kind of thing comes up a lot in moms and just anytime you're talking to women. And I think the biggest thing that stands out to me is just that there's a distinction between a woman having a different role and a woman being of different worth.
Oh, yeah.
So just having,
Yeah.
just because, and also just thinking about back in that time, women were not educated. Women, so would their role necessarily have been naturally to teach if they hadn't been educated in that society? But that's not saying that they're not important, they're not included, they're not, it's just that is the role that they had at that time. So
There's
that's the way I
there's
think
always
about
an
it.
equal worth, even as we have different roles, perhaps, that sort of aspect.
And I think
of
it's
it.
important for us to think about that too. Women on either side of things, whether they stay at home with their kids or whether they go to work, both sides think of themselves as worth. Which one is
Yeah.
more worth? And it's not about that. Like we always have the same worth. It's
Yeah.
just a different role that we're playing in our household at that time.
Yeah. No, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Andrew, any thoughts on that?
Well, I do think it probably was a bit countercultural that
No doubt.
he would single out 9 ladies. There's some debate about whether Junia or Junius, what's the right translation. So I don't know where you're going to come down on that one. But let's just say 9 that Paul would single out. I think really does say something about the role that the women played in the mission and the ministry of the early church, and it was an active one. And so it certainly wasn't a misogynistic culture, I think, that was super, like men are of greater worth. I think it recognized, we can affirm that very much Paul is recognizing the worth of men and women.
Yeah, and I think
in the early church.
Yeah, and maybe to the practical aspect of this question is like, okay, so in Corinthians, he says, he says about sitting quiet, and but in context, just a few chapters early, 1 Corinthians 11, he's talking about how women pray and prophesy in church. But in 14, he is introducing this order of service, this sort of chaos that had erupted around speaking in tongues. And this is where he introduces tell them to be quiet. You sit down. So, perhaps an evidence of these women were really abusing this speaking in tongues. And in 1 Timothy, where he's talking about learn quietly, there was this sort of not subverting authority, but the imperative is to learn. And so I think the counterculture was, well, we're sort of inviting in order to learn. So do so without disruption. So I think there's some of that, but we see evidence of the deaconess of the church, right? That we see with Phoebe, a patron of mine. The financial support, her house church. So there were many, many ways that I think the women within Paul's ministry were active within that, but that just look like different roles and some very similar roles, I think.
And it could have just been a wrong timing. If there was an individual in our church that stood up during, the sermon and kept asking questions, that would be this is not the time for that. We're going to be here until the evening if you keep asking questions. So I wonder if it was some specific to that group of believers, something that was happening that.
I think so. I think the quiet also was, again, that word is not so much like, all right, never say a word. That word is, don't create turmoil. Keep it down over there. It's kind of but there is clear language around, the authorship, the creation order, and all that kind of thing. So that's probably another table talk.
It could be
but I think that's a great question. And again, equal value, different roles, and just a lot of work going on there. And that list certainly points to that. So wonderful question there. Different question. And Abigail, I'm going to ask you. So this is from Caitlin, and it's really an observation from the sermon yesterday. It says, we've moved a couple of times, and I just wanted to affirm your point that you become most connected when you engage in church community. And she said, thank you. The question then is, you guys moved here cross country
Washington State.
From
5
Washington
years
State.
ago.
Different
5
culture.
years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that was your first call. So you weren't originally from the Southeast or Mid-Atlantic.
No.
You were from.
You weren't familiar with Bless Your Heart.
I met a Southern woman at.
I met one once.
I met one in Mops over there, and she would talk about, bless your heart is not necessarily a compliment.
Yeah.
So I had a little inkling, but
Okay. Yeah.
So with that, is this something that you find true, or I also want to make reference that, hey, it may not be as easy as Andrew said. There may be challenges to it. What was your learning or lesson?
I don't know if you remember this actually, but when we first moved here, my husband and I were so excited to get into, we got to know people, because my family came at Thanksgiving and helped us move and then moved back. Or went home. So in December, we're thinking, we got to know people. We're going to have Christmas all by ourselves, and all of this. And so we both sent you an email separately, not knowing that the other one had, saying, we need a small group. Where's the small group? And you had to, they're taking a break right now. Hold on, January's coming,
Yes. And then you came to Taste of Community.
Yeah, came to Taste of Community. And
Yes. Yeah.
And it really was, for us, it was getting involved in a small group. It was moms was huge for me because, the like-minded. And not only that, getting, I think the important thing is just knowing it's going to take time. Community, I mean, you can jump into a small group. You may or may not connect with them right away. Right. Sometimes you have to try a couple, to find personalities that you click with, and or something like Moms. You can come to Moms, and it takes some time to really figure out where you fit, and just being consistent with it and patient with it, but making strides yourself. I tended to be more of an introvert growing up. You never know it now, but I expected people to come to me and then would get bitter when, nobody's noticing that I'm all by myself. And I figured out that I had to take the initiative to invite people to what I was doing, and to, we tend to find people, well, I want to be friends with that person, but they maybe their bracket is full, if that makes any sense, and you have to find the people that need community you need community. And that just takes time.
It does. That's a great word. You said something too, Andrew, that resonated with me, and I don't know, Abigail, if you found this, but even within small groups, again, the taking time to cut and really to build that life on life, the service part, your quote around, serving, there's nothing like connection. What was it, the quote you used? It was one of the pastors, I thought.
Oh, I was talking to J.D. Greer. I listened to on occasion to a message from the Summit Church. I enjoy the way that he communicates Scripture, but I can't even remember the message, but I remember he said they did a survey recently in their church, and they found that the common denominator for the people who felt most connected were those that were on a ministry team in their church. Yeah. That's a large church, so that's pretty good random sampling.
And so that tells me serving together.
Serving together, being in a small group.
Right?
I'm remembering the squatty potty. That was what stuck out to me.
So,
yeah.
My dad was in the military. We moved a lot growing up. I was in the military before I went to seminary and came here. So I think here's a pitfall to avoid. I would tell people. There's never going to be a church like your last church. People come in and we say, we're looking for a church like our last one. Doesn't exist. There's going to be something about your old church, whether it, we miss the worship, or we miss the preaching, or we you know what? It's a new season. Just go forward with it. And so my advice to folks is take your list, if you're new to the community, go visit the 3 or 4 churches, and then just pick one and plug in. I watched people at seminary take 4 years and never find a church, just visiting different ones at some point you just, hey, it's not exactly what I had where I came from, but just make it your church and plug in. I mean, you moved a ton, David.
Well, I was going to say, so even the testimony to that is we moved 10 times.
In how many years?
And that was over that first sort of 20 years.
Okay.
So between 18 months and 3 years. And so really we joined 8 different churches. So it took a couple moves to sort of us to get in the process. And what we eventually
Yeah.
found was that before we even would close on a home, we were hopeful to have found a church. And in that, if I go back and I look at those 8 church memberships,
Yeah.
there were a small church, big church, churches that met in a traditional church with a steeple and a bell, and churches that met in sort of this mega plaza,
Yeah.
but the connection with the people were the same in all of them.
Yeah.
The importance, the serving, the
Yeah.
getting involved, and those are the connections we remember today.
Yep.
And that was definitely what we
Yeah.
found, the greatest need
Yeah.
in any relocation. And so,
I know you want to move us on.
yeah.
But let me just say this, because I was so blessed by this. Last night the youth had a Friendsgiving. We had middle school and high school students. A little, 15 minutes at the end. Anybody want to share a testimony? You might remember Isabella. She was baptized a few weeks ago. 7th grade girl. She took the microphone and said, "Hey, I'm a military family." Her dad is here temporarily. He's the recruiter for the area, but she just jumped in. She went on the youth retreat this summer when we all went to the beach. And she was just saying how much how hard it can be moving so much, and how much she felt like family and how it connected here. And she just went for it.
Yeah.
She just signed up for the treat. She got involved. I think youth do have an advantage anytime you're going away and you're spending that much time plus proximity. Like when you're just hanging out, for 90 minutes a week, it takes a little bit longer. It's going to take a year before you really feel like you have good friends. It might even take 2 or 3.
Yeah.
But there are things like the more time you spend, you do those trips together and you make those shared memories, it accelerates it.
Yeah.
And Paul had that advantage. I mean, when you're on a boat with someone,
Yeah.
that's a microwave.
Yeah. That's right.
When you're getting beaten and thrown in the stockade, I guarantee you he's pretty close with Barnabas.
Yeah. And so that would be our prayer, even to anyone watching today or 3 months from today, or in Clemens or in Chicago, wherever you might be watching this. Maybe this is an encouragement you need to jump in, find connection at your local church, and with that, why don't we go to the final word?
Okay.
So we just sort of have a final comment, and this week, because we're wrapping it up, it could be a final comment on chapter 16 maybe, but also just anything on Romans in general that you want to share. Abigail, we'll start with you.
So thinking about the book of Romans is really personal to me. I don't know if I've said this to either of you before, but my grandfather was a Baptist minister. And his role in the second half of his ministry was going into churches that were ready to close their doors, and he was going to try and revive them.
Okay.
Wow.
He always started with taking a year and preaching through Romans.
Wow.
That's what he did. And time and time again, after his time was done, they'd say, "Can you stay forever?" And he'd say, "It's time to move on to the next church," But I heard growing up how much Romans, if you as a body can focus on what are the essentials and what are we unified around and what is the most important things, that's what builds the church and that's what makes it, stay grounded and stay unified. But
Yeah.
That's a great word. Thanks for sharing that. It's a great story. Andrew.
Well, there's a lot I wanted to say in Romans 16 that I didn't get to, so you're going to force me to pick one. I would say very beginning of Romans, very end of Romans. It's this idea of the revelation of Jesus Christ, and why that happened was to bring about the obedience of faith. And you see it at the very beginning, and you see there's more than one commonality between the beginning of the book and the end. So there's a lot more that Paul uses to tie the thing together. But this idea that the obedience that we should have isn't an obedience that comes from duty. It's not this obedience in order to get salvation. It's that Jesus came, and the obedience that we have now as a result of his followers is because of our faith. It's not this like and here's what you need to do in order if you want to be saved. It's the faith that comes first.
Yeah.
And then there's this obedience, and it's for all the nations. Yeah. He says that at both the beginning and the end.
Yeah. Man, that's a good word. Good word. Well, I'll just close this sort of in the word as well. In 16, I just, the lasting impact on me is just the humanity that we see. I'd love to know the stories behind each of these names.
Yeah.
And I was particularly drawn to 7. Of course, everyone's drawn to Rufus, but verse 7 is not Rufus, but greet Andronicus and Junia, as you mentioned. My kinsmen and my fellow prisoners, they are well known to the apostles, and they were in Christ before me. So there's almost this sense of admiration that Paul has, that maybe that they had some bearing on his maturity, and just the humanity behind them, is I think is really awesome. And then again, just in Romans itself, as we heard as we started from all of the theologians and pastors who have come before us, it is one of the most complete revelations of the gospel in all of Scripture, and I think we have found that to be true. This is what the gospel is, the essentials, and now this is how it should change your life. And for that, we are not ashamed.
That's right.
The power of God unto salvation for all who will really believe. Well, I think that's a great final word to our season 2, and we wrap up Romans, and we look forward to joining you again in February as we begin a new season on Table Talk in the Gospel according to, and if you hit that subscribe button, it will come up when we're ready to go again. And so we look forward to joining you. Thank you for staying with us, and thanks for joining us at the table today. Blessings, friends. See you soon.